What's up everybody, and welcome to another War Within video. Today we're going to be talking, or rather re-talking, about the Mythic DPS rankings for the first raid in the War Within. And the reason why I say remaking this is because I started reading this with the hopes of going, oh, here's a first place, second place, third place. Like, it's obvious, you know, you may have some more in this category, but you can tell who's good versus who's bad. Wasn't that at all. It's much more complex than I imagined. So as I've learned a little bit more about this, I thought I would redo this video and also maybe explain some of the things that I learned, hopefully to make it easier for you to understand, as well as maybe this will kind of give you a little bit more perspective of why it's important to have these rankings, but also to know what's important from these graphs and from these displays and what they mean exactly. So let's get into it. So to start, I'm going to be referencing this population size frequently, but it's just going to be briefly, but just understanding that when it comes to terms of popularity, it has largely to do with the amount of people signal from when groups bring players due to certain buffs and utility they provide, not just their raw throughput. So this can be influenced by things like community bias. So you may see something like, I think the one that I saw the most was Retribution Paladin was very high in how many people were there. You also have Arcane Mage, of course, and Fury Warrior, but sometimes these things can be influenced by community bias, and you can have a lot less people playing of other classes, say like Rogue, which are only contribute a few thousand, whereas some of these are closer to 10,000. So to begin, I mean, the most important the thing to look at, some might think, is the throughput, because that is your damage. But as you can see, some of these rankings change dramatically. So that my first question was, how are these ranked? And so a lot of times you'll see numbers such as like percentiles and graphs that'll show these percentiles. And I didn't know necessarily what exactly that meant. I know percentiles in general, but for the most part, you know, if you're looking at what say a 95 percentile means, that's often referenced as what they used for this data. What it means is basically, if you are in a 95th percentile, basically it is there are only 5% of the scores that are higher than yours. So when you look at these rankings and they show something like 95th percentile, what it means simply is that these are the scores from 95% and above, you know, like from a 95 to 100. And when you're comparing these scores, say if all DPS, this is basically, when you have a 95% score and they're on top like this, and you look at a score like this that has an 81.27 percentile score, that means 19% of somewhere mixed in here of other DPS are better scores than Augmentation Evoker. And it goes from the top too. So in this, there are 5%, or the 5 percentile, 5% of scores are better than Fire Mage. So that there are some that can go higher, can go lower, but it's not exclusive to one particular class, and it can be heavily influenced by things like popularity. So the number of people playing in a certain class, considering there can be thousands in a certain class, and so that raised the second question for me, which was, how are these influenced by popularity? And so, or why are they influenced so drastically by popularity? And I looked into, of course, some of the easiest ones to review, which were Mage and Warrior. So if you go into Mage and Warrior and the rankings, you may be deceived because, one, there's so much data. But let's go into the tier list here, and you can see something like Fire Mage being on the C tier list, but if you were just to look at the throughput damage, it can be deceiving because, oh, wow, Fire Mage is up here. So why is it so different? And that's why I was confused. And so clicking on it and looking at what it actually has, there's a lot of spells that make them highly mobile. They also inherently have a lot, inherently AoE through Mastery Ignite, which is valuable for many raid encounters. But it looks like their damage is lackluster compared to other options. So when you look at it and you go to the damage, you'll see that the charts show that their overall damage is better than Arcane Mage, but it's kind of skewing the data to make it seem like the case is incorrect. But if you look at the numbers, just the popularity, if you look at Fire Mage 1268 and Arcane 11,270. So it's like, well, what does Arcane Mage have that Frost doesn't have? So going into their ranking, S tier ranking, they have massive damage, nerfs, but basically affects their rotation and their actual damage numbers. So they have big damage, and where they, I guess, struggle the most is the comparing into the AoE, but their survivability. So going back into this chart, when it comes to Arcane and it comes to Fire takes the cake, but I mean, how much do you need survivability in these situations? And so I asked myself another question, which is, when it comes to deaths, how are these things calculated in survivability? Basically, for every kill, a death involved is still a kill tracked, and this basically will count death saves, and basically how much or how often within the raid you're dying. So survivability has a number of things, of course, that track it, but basically how often players die is a good indicator of defensive strength. So if you're dying a lot, it's highly indicative that there isn't a lot of defensives. And obviously you can see things like warriors, because of course warriors are heavily dependent on having a healer, and also warriors got notably nerfed for having a lack of defensive, whereas DK is kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum. So looking further into the popularity sides of things, you go from S tier to C tier in this case. I was wondering, the main thing is well, we know why certain classes are popular and why they're more effective, but how do they use it as a metric? So looking at the metrics, you can see here that it says this means that the majority of the time, the most popular choice is the best choice, especially for things like enchants, gems, and consumables. However, particularly for gear, there can be scenarios where the most popular choice isn't the best terms of total player power. And basically what that means is, often in the start of a season, a lot of people might have an easy to access Mythic Plus item versus having a raid item, because there may be limited amounts that it drops, and it's much easier to get a Mythic Plus item versus the raid item. As things progress, people may be getting more of those raid tiered items. So with that being the case, this can shift dramatically on how much throughput players are putting out. So for right now, you can consider that a lot of these classes that are having equal like throughput on damage, but at different levels on popularity, could be affected in time depending on how the drops affect their abilities. Now, this is not going to happen across the board, but it is important to understand that right now a lot of people are relying on Mythic Plus gear acquired versus Raid Plus gear acquired. So it does not mean, so when looking at these numbers again, that these low numbers are indicative of what it's always going to be like, but simply that right now, I mean, if you the better example for DPS that I think is unfortunate for me as a someone who likes Fury and Arms but has struggling picking, is the difference between, I mean, I'm losing it here, but the difference between, he got Fury and Arms right below it. So I was looking at it and going like, well, the differences here in the amount of them is staggering. So let's look at this. So Arms does well at 2 target situations, but outside of those cases, Fury is likely to be the easier spec to get good mileage out of it. Also offers a slightly stronger self-healing kit and can adapt to different coolant down timings and target counts more easily than Arms, which tends to be a little bit more locked into specific burst windows and talent builds for specific target counts. So in this, when you see that the popularity of Fury is much higher than something like Arms, it's like, well, I mean, is there damage a staggering a difference enough to be like, I'm gonna pick Fury over this? Well, I think the popularity choice is driving this for a majority part, because it's a lot easier to get into. So going back into the importance of popularity into this, you could say like, oh, well, at some point that popularity could shift, but if it's accessible, if it's more accessible for people to get into raid and be successful in, and this is harder to, what would be your reasoning for choosing that? I mean, if you have multiple DPS specs, you would more than likely choose the best option and the most accessible option, and then maybe at a later point shift to maybe a higher throughput, depending on, you know, like depending on how gear shifts throughout. But this is like my, I guess my important takeaway from these charts and how to use these charts is that it is important to understand that popularity does drive a lot of the game. I mean, it's going to be what's most available for, because it's going to be what crafters make the most. It's going to be what people know how to access the most and know how to utilize the most. When you have data that shows that there's thousands more of arcane mages, there's going to be much more available data for you to be successful as an arcane mage versus being successful as a fire mage. So understand that even though popularity isn't the ultimate determiner of how much DPS we're outputting, it can be indicative of, well, maybe this spec like fire isn't as accessible to compared to arcane, because when people are considered bossing, they're more likely to choose arcane because it is going to perform better versus this situation where it may perform better in the overall. So comparing, obviously, so you can see here overall the damage of fire kind of inching out arcane just barely, and then when you go to bossing, I mean, fire just drops all the way down. So it's like there is a significant change in that. It's just not always easy to perceive how that changes just looking at it on a base level. So main things to take away from this is that popularity is largely king, but it's not everything, but it is very important. Throughput it's very hard to tell if that means, oh well, this is the best, it clearly has the biggest number, but also how much population size can skew that amount. So the other thing is, when you have something like population and you're going, all right, so in augmentation evoker, you have, it's in an 81 percentile, so 19% of scores are better than an augmentation evoker. But then you go down to something like, see how many, so 4497, and let's find one that's like right above it. Let's find one right above. So let's look at rogues, because rogues are right above that. So rogues, you have 1154, 5636, and 2249. So with that, you just have sort of compounding numbers of scores that could be possibly higher, because their population is going to massively outweigh it. Now, of course, you have devastation evoker, but if we do the same thing, so we go hunters, let's take a look at hunters. Basically, let's see how many scores could edge out hunters, because hunters seem to be doing better. So devastation 2700, and then survival hunter 800, 3900, 6300. That's huge in comparison. So it also skews the numbers to be like, well, there's so many more that are performing percentiles higher than your devastation evoker, but that is largely influenced by the amount of people that get invited. You know, how many people are getting invited to these raids as an evoker. In some classes, unfortunately, like Retribution Paladin, for example, can be edged out largely because how many paladins do you need in a group? So the red paladin has a tremendous amount of utility, and they do bring devotion aura, which is valuable, but it's something that most guilds have brought a holy paladin for in the past few years, and that trend seems to continue. So it's like, how many paladins are you going to bring into a group? The classic example always is like, how many shamans do you need? Because you only need one shaman to lust. So I mean, so it's those things can be influenced, and I want you to understand, or the thing, something that I didn't understand even when I was looking at this, is that it's not always black and white how to look at this. Personally, if you're gonna pick any of these to be the most valuable, I would pick popularity followed by survivability. So if you're looking at something like Frost DK, okay, it does the A tier, does pretty decent at popularity. So and comparatively damage wise, it's pretty high on the rankings. So we'll go over here. You know, like you can see the bossing is not necessarily the same, but overall, so maybe I would be able to get a spot in that raid, and I'm able to survive in that raid, but they do fantastic overall because they kind of meet all three qualities, and I chose how I ranked them specifically, but I think it's whatever matters to you the most, you know, whatever trying to parses you're trying to make. And also understand that this will change and shift over time, especially as people start to do crazier parses, and people try to do different team comps that have random availability and like random like achievability because they did something so specific to it. I've already seen people do clears that are single class, like it's all druids, you know, so that sometimes these crazy comps can also shift things dramatically, and you can get people who have a higher max ceiling, but it may be a majority of people are performing, you know, so somewhere in the middle to low end. So understanding 95th percentile and what it means, understanding what these statistics mean and how population affects that dramatically, and then of course understanding why people pick certain classes over another. Like, a lot of times it's accessibility. So if you see that your class is performing well, but there's not a lot of them, maybe it's better to understand that the reason why maybe you're not being picked is because, like for example, Fury Warrior is very cozy melee to play in raid with a cooldown suite that can be adjusted easily to work well on most encounters, pretty much any amount of targets or add spawn timing. So it's much more accessible, and if you do find yourself struggling within your class, I don't want you to look on this and be like, wow, I'm performing not optimally, I need to play Fury Warrior. It can be that your Arms Warrior can do decent enough, and if you're comfortable with it, then that's totally fine, but understanding that Fury is going to have a lot more opportunities for you to do better if you're not feeling good about your class, or you're not feeling good about your spec that you're playing currently. So I hope this helps a little bit to help you understand where exactly, like why exactly these charts matter, and where it's coming from exactly. Personally, as a warrior who plays tank, I definitely am interested in trying out Fury again. And if it's nice and cozy, I'd be into it for sure. But most likely I'll be tanking anyway, so I'm not sure that it'll matter. Of course, I'll try to put rank or like the links in the chat, but there's a bunch of rankings. So the main one is archon.gg. That's the one I got all the information about these charts from. Of course, Warcraft logs for all the data, and then in Wowhead, for those of you who are interested, there is also healer rankings as well as tank rankings. So if you'd like me to break down as well as those specs those classes as well, those specs and classes as well, let me know, and I can try to break those down to help those be a little bit more understanding for you. Of course, interpret it as you see fit, whatever fits you the best. I hope this helps, and ultimately I hope this helps you improve like you know where you're gonna build or how you're gonna build into your raiding future. So and that's all I got for this one. Make sure to like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the page, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.